Revelation according to Peter, Barnes that is, Part 13, The Great Harlot.
Again, we have a close-up, because we've actually finished the details of the Great Tribulation. Remember that? Last week we dealt with the outpouring of the last of the bowls of God's wrath, by which the judgments of God were completed, and we saw exactly, an overview of everything that was due to happen in a kind of a microcosm there. And now we're looking in detail at the last of the great characters or groups for identification that are on the earth during the tribulation period. And we've got to identify this one. It's very important. It's going to play a major role, especially in the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. And so we want to know what the relationship of this new identity is, and its relationship with the beast that we've already identified in chapter 13 as the Antichrist and his kingdom. Are you with me? So without any more ado, let's get into it and see exactly what the Bible tells us about this final close-up, which is going to occupy chapters 17 and 18 of the book of Revelation.
Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of sexual immorality, and those who live on the earth became drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality."
So the account begins with the approach by one of the 7 angels to John. Those the 7 angels that had poured out these bowls of God's anger. Doesn't say which one, but most likely it was the 7th. I'll tell you why, because he says that he's going to go into detail with John and show him the judgment that is to come upon the great harlot, Babylon the Great. Now if you back up a few verses into chapter 16, verse 17, we were told when the 7th angel poured out his bowl, there were flashes of lightning and judgments and thunder, etc. Verse 19, the great city was split into 3 parts. The cities of the nations fell, and Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And so it was the 7th angel that was associated with the pouring out of this bowl of wrath, of judgment upon Babylon the Great. Reasonably, he would be the suitable candidate, and the angel would come forward and explain to John in more detail about what was mentioned just very briefly there in that one verse. Are you with me? You understand what I'm saying there? Now he's going to tell John, all about this judgment on this harlot. Now, the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Now, the harlot is an old archaic English word. What's the word we use today? Prostitute. Yeah, prostitute. Harlot is the old English King James word. That's what they used to call them back in those days. Harlots. But don't forget now, we're not talking about prostitution in any physical sense. We're talking about prostitution in a purely spiritual sense. This is going to turn out to be a great religious harlot, okay? Very important to understand that. A harlot, of course, is generally designated a term for the woman. Back in the King James Bible, male prostitutes were not designated harlots, okay? They had other terminology for them. And so the word harlot is the feminine form, and it suggests a woman. We have quite a number of illustrations in the Bible where women are likened to religious organizations. Women are likened to religious organizations connected with religious covenants, religious nations. For example, did you know that the nation of Israel was designated as a woman? She was in a religious covenant with God Almighty, with Yahweh, the God of Israel. He viewed Israel to be his wife, and he was her husband. And he was married to her via the Mosaic covenant. Did you know that? And every time the nation of Israel turned away from the pure worship of her husband Yahweh to the worship of other gods, God would use the word adulteress for her. He would say to Israel, "You are an adulteress, and I'm going to issue you a bill of divorcement." You see? This is the language that's used for a marriage contract, isn't it? And breaking a marriage contract. I mean, but it's all on the spiritual level. It has nothing to do with physical things. It's being spiritually faithful to God in a covenant or contract with Him, and then turning round and breaking that spiritual contact and having, as it were, adulterous spiritual relationships with other gods, with foreign deities, and with false religious concepts. Are you with me? Now, in Christianity, we have a parallel, because Jesus Christ is called the bridegroom, isn't he? Does he not have a bride? Who is it? Us. We're in a marriage contract with Jesus Christ. We're promised to him in marriage. And later on in the book of Revelation, believe it or not, when we get into chapter 19, we're going to be witnesses to the marriage of the Lamb. Isn't that something? The actual marriage feast itself between the Lamb, Jesus, and between his church, his bride.
And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup of abominations and of the unclean things of her sexual immorality.
Okay, now, coming back to chapter 17 there. Now, notice please that the woman is doing something. What's she doing in verse 3? Yeah, she's sitting on the back of this beast that is full of blasphemous names, the beast that has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. Now remember, each of those heads represents a ruler and a kingdom, and each of the horns represents a ruler. So we're talking about a political combine composed of 17 rulers and possibly 17 kingdoms to go with them. Are you with me? 7 kings and 10 horns. They all represent political rules and kingdoms over which those leaders rule. And so we're looking at an international combine of kingdoms being ruled under the Antichrist. Now to get the picture. Good. And this woman is sitting where? On the back of that political beast. That's where she's sitting. Now, a lot of commentaries will suggest the idea that because the woman is sitting on the back of this beast, that she is actually in control, like you or I getting on the back of a horse and riding a horse, okay? But I don't think so. I don't believe that this woman is actually in control, and I think as we go along we'll see that. She's just going along for the ride. She's being supported by this Antichrist worldwide political beast. She's getting her support from it. You get the idea? And without the support of the beast, she would no longer be able to continue to exist. As I said, this woman doesn't really exist yet, historically in time. She's not in existence. She will come into existence during the tribulation period. And what principles is she going to be based upon? If she's a religious empire, then she has to have religious ideals, beliefs, principles and practices. Isn't that true? You see? Well, the secret is in the word. Look. Verse 5, and upon her forehead a name was written, a mystery, what? Babylon the Great. Yeah. Babylon the Great. What do we know about Babylon? We've talked about Babylon in our group study here on Tuesday nights. Can you remember anything about Babylon?
All the mystery religions and all that. All that false religions and teachings and astrology and all that.
Yeah, right. And the history of Babylon is amazing because it goes back as far as we can go in post-flood times. Because after the flood, when Noah and his 3 boys and their wives came out of the ark, God gave them a mandate. He said to Noah, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Do you remember that? And so Noah was told that he was going to have to expand the human family around the entire planet, similar to what God had told Adam and his wife to do originally. Now, within a couple of 100 years of that mandate being given to Noah's 3 sons and their wives, there had arisen, of course, there was an explosion of population because, they were all still living for periods of more than 200 years, and they were having kids and many generations of children appearing rapidly. And within a couple of 100 years after the flood, there was an expanding population, but they were all being held together on the plains of Shinar in the Mesopotamian Valley area because of the influence of 2 people. A man by the name of Nimrod and his mother Semiramis. Okay? The Bible tells you in chapter 11 all about Nimrod. This is what he did. He was a great chieftain. He established himself as a tyrant and a dictator and a king and an emperor over all the people living on the plains of Shinar, and he was preventing them from expanding out beyond that area by engaging them all together in building projects. The Bible lists the great cities that he had built, and also in addition to that there was a religious project known as the Tower of... Yes, originally of course known as Babilu in the Chaldean, which meant the gate of God. You see, which was another thing that Nimrod was doing. God had promised never to flood the earth again, never to destroy mankind entirely by means of a flood. And the first thing Nimrod did was to have this huge tower built, as he said, to reach above into the heavens, you see, because he didn't believe God, he didn't trust God, and he was a rebel against God. All the people in the world at that time, in that area, of course, spoke the same language. So what did God do? Came down and zapped them, confused their languages, broke them up into their little ethnic groups, their language groups, and they had to split off and migrate and do what he told them to in the first place, spread out and fill the earth. You get it? The spirit of Babylon began then. It was then that Semiramis introduced astrology into worship, because when her son Nimrod died, she claimed that God had deified him and made him into a god, and she pointed to the constellation Orion, which is in the heavens now, and she said that that was her son Nimrod deified as a god in heaven. And from that moment on, the Babylonians worshipped Nimrod, you see, under that constellation. And but in the development of this Babylonish religion, it reappeared again in the 7th century BC under the great Babylonian emperor named, who can name him? Nebuchadnezzar, who became the arch enemy of the nation of Israel, overthrew the Jewish nation and destroyed the capital city of Jerusalem, decimated the temple of Yahweh, and took all the Israelites of that day captive into Babylon for how many years? 70 years. An entire generation they spent in slavery in Babylon. And at that time Babylon reached its spiritual height and had enlarged and expanded the borders of its religious practices with its pantheon of false gods and its astrology and its necromancers and foretellers of the future and all kinds of trimmings and trappings that they had. And believe me, even when Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar and his successor kings, when that finally was defeated by the Medes and the Persians in 539 BC, its religious empire and influence remained and permeated all of the major empires to follow. The Medo-Persian Empire adopted many of the Babylonian astrological principles and belief systems, immortality of the soul and things like that. After them, the Grecian Empire that followed did the same thing. The Roman Empire that followed swallowed the whole concept and enlarged on it. And then, of course, unfortunately, after the commencement of Christianity at the beginning of the first millennium, those Babylonian principles began to creep back even into the church itself, you see? And so the spirit of Babylon the Great has been here with us for 4,500 years, according to biblical time. The spirit of Babylon's there. But the empire of Babylon as a visible entity has not been with us and will not be with us until the beginning of the tribulation period. Are you with me? So that's what we've got. Now, it is centered, and it always has been centered in the same place. When it began with the Tower of Babel, where was the Tower of Babel? Right in the middle of the plains of Shinar. And where was that located with regard to countries today? Iraq, smack bang dang in the middle of Iraq. Oh yeah, I'm not kidding. Look, if you look at any map of the whole Middle East area, you start with Turkey, and you see in the mountainous regions of Turkey the beginning of two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And they come out from those mountains, and they cascade down, and they strike downwards in a southeasterly direction, and they dissect the nation, the modern nation of Iraq, completely in half. And the two rivers run pretty much parallel to each other. Look at them on any map. In fact, when they get to the middle of Iraq, they get very close together. In the middle of Iraq, the two rivers are much less than 100 miles apart. These two great rivers. And Babel was situated right between the two rivers. Are you with me? Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was situated right on the bank of the Euphrates River. Wasn't that true? Well, what have you got out there today? You've got Baghdad, which is less than 100 miles north of where the ancient Tower of Babel used to be. How about that? Verse 6. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of who? The saints and of the witnesses of Jesus. So what's that telling us? Well, it's telling us in the setting of the book of Revelation and in the setting of the tribulation, it means that this great religious empire has worked hand in glove with the Antichrist to bring about the execution of God's saints, God's people, who stood for the truth and the testimony of Jesus. And this woman has worked hand in glove with the Antichrist, with the beast, in order to bring about their execution. And so she is held just as responsible for the death of the saints as the Antichrist and his political empire. Are you with me? Yeah. She is held responsible for their death. So she's a great opposer of the truth of Christianity. No question about that. The angel in verse 7 says to John, why are you puzzled? You know, why do you wonder? I'm going to tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, the beast that had the 7 heads and the 10 horns. Okay? He said, I'm going to tell you all about it. Aren't we fortunate that he's going to tell us all about it? So he says, here we go. Look, it's easy. Verse 8. The beast that you saw was and is not, is about to come out of the abyss and go into destruction. Hey, look, there's your clue. We've already studied about that in chapter 13, about the beast that went into the abyss and came out of the abyss and attacked the two witnesses in Jerusalem. You remember that? So who's it talking about? The Antichrist. But when he's coming to that point of almost the height of his power, gets what? What happens to him? Struck down. He's assassinated. And then Satan comes and absolutely does what? Possesses him while he's in the abyss and raises him out of the abyss, and he comes to life again. Now the whole world wonders because of this mighty miracle that's happened to this politician. He's the wonder-working man of the age, and everybody's in absolute amazement at him. So now we've got the time period, because John's talking about the beast that was in the abyss and is not and is about to come out. We know that that's the midway mark of the tribulation. We got it. We pinned it down again. And so now we know the beast then is the Antichrist coming up out of the abyss. He's associated with that big empire with the 7 heads and the 10 horns, and he's going to go into destruction. Those who dwell on the earth will wonder. And notice please who these are, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the... Their names are not there in the Lamb's book of life, so they're going to be deceived, and they're going to be impressed by the beast that is not, and they'll see that he was and he is not, and he will come. Verse 9, here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. By the way, very often, though, mountains are used to symbolize what? Government and kingdom, you see. And it says, and they are 7 kings. And so we're identifying them as 7 rulers now. 7 rulers of these 7 governments. 5 have fallen. 1 is, and another has not yet come. Now, 5 have fallen. It's very difficult to decipher and equate it with, historical activity. But what it could be is that this political empire of the beast that's composed of the 7 heads and the 10 horns, which are all political powers, actually could be based upon the remnants of all the earlier biblical civilizations and empires. The 5 that have fallen could be, number 1, the early Egyptian Empire, followed by the Assyrian Empire, followed by the Babylonian Empire, followed by the Grecian Empire, followed by the Medo-Persian Empire, or something like that. Or it could start with Babylon, because Babylon was the chief opponent of God's people, the nation of Israel. It could go Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, you see, and so on. It's difficult to know which combination of rulers it is that have fallen, but we can accept that there are 5 of them that have, already exercised power. And the word beast now, remember, this is where it gets so confusing for people. Now, if you can hear me out on this, this might help. Sometimes John, in the book of Revelation, applies the beast to the actual Antichrist himself, that one individual. At other times, he applies the word beast to his entire empire. His political empire with the 7 heads and the 10 horns is the beast. You get it? Because they are so closely associated with one another. I've got a feeling I'm speaking Chinese tonight. You get it? Sometimes John will call the beast, and he's talking about the Antichrist himself. And other times when he talks about the beast, he's talking about the entire 7-headed, 10-horned beast, which is the empire that's under Antichrist's control. And so now we've read verse 15. We know that the harlot is controlling the people. Verse 16, the 10 horns which you saw and the beast. Now watch this. What's their attitude going to be towards Babylon the Great? They're going to hate her. They're going to hate the harlot, it says. They're going to make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with... So now we started off in the vision, in the close-up, with this magnificently dressed, magnificently attired religious empire sitting on the back of the beast, and now we see the 10 horns of the beast turning upon that religious empire with hatred to rend her to pieces and to destroy her. And it's obviously in the judgment of God, isn't it? This is God's judgment against this Babylonish empire of false religion. They will make her desolate, and they will make her naked, and they will eat her flesh, and they will burn her up with... Well, there's not going to be much left when that's all over. This empire is really going to be decimated and destroyed by these powers under the control of the Antichrist. Now, it's only a point of interest to keep in mind. It's only the 10 horns that do this. It is not the 7 other kings. Remember, Antichrist's empire controls 7 kings and 10 horns. This work of destruction is carried out specifically by the 10 horns, not the 7 kings. And so there's a division of forces here within the empire's kingdom. Obviously the 7 kings have no part in the work of destruction, but the 10 political leaders do. Just as a matter of simple arithmetic, 7 kings and 10 kings adds up to how many kings? 17. Great! 17 kings. So it means the Antichrist political domain is exercised over this huge area dominated by 17 rulers. You get it? It's obviously that the 10 horns have been reserved for this special job, and they're identified for the work of destroying the Babylon,
We're going to get it for it.
But don't forget the beast himself, the Antichrist, is in agreement with those 10. Did you notice that? Go back to the verse again, look. Verse 16. And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate thee. Harlot. So the very Antichrist himself, who was responsible for bringing the whole thing together, and to put the whole arrangement into operation, is the one who is heading up the revolt against the religious aspect of the combination. You get it? He's the one that's doing it. Why is he doing it? Because he's already established himself as God. And now this religion has become a rival to him. Get it? He wants supreme command, not only politically, not only economically, not only militarily, but he wants it spiritually. Yeah, and so the Antichrist is treacherously going to turn on the only organized form of religion left in the world, and he's going to annihilate it.
But it's a false religion, right? It's a
Yeah,
harlot.
yeah, that's right.
So that's in the last hour, though.
That's in the last stretches, the last remaining time of the time of the end. Yeah.
Now, this creature, are we given to try to visualize the anatomy of the creature? Because if you've got a creature with 7 heads and 10 horns, the horns are on the head. So does that mean that now 7 heads, we've got some heads with 2 horns, some heads with only 1 horn?
No, it just indicates rulership. It means that he himself is the top dog on a political combine, and underneath him there are 17 rulers.
So when John, did John actually see this as a creature, or is he using a descriptive thing to try to explain to later generations what is going to happen?
No, he saw it in visionary form as a beast. Yeah, it was presented to him in signs and symbols, you see. And so no doubt he saw it like almost, if you like, a cartoonist drawing these weird pictures, you see. He saw it there, and he described what he saw, but of course it's symbolic, you see, and it represents political rulers, political empires, religious organizations, religious empires. You get the idea? Verse 17 shows who is the real moving force behind the destruction. For who has put it into their hearts? God has put it into their hearts to execute whose purpose? His purpose. By having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be
Fulfilled.
yeah, which all proves what we said all along, that regardless of what's going on the surface, what appears to be happening, God is calling the shots. God is in charge, and he always has been, and he always will.
End of discussion.
And the woman who you saw is a great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And we've always suggested that that is that city that's going to be there in Iraq today, which is still Babylon, isn't it? No question about it. In fact, if you go out to, say, Iraq and tour the cities of Iraq, including Baghdad, you're going to be impressed with the Babylonish nature of the whole country. They're still preserving Babylonish artifacts from the original Babylon. Did you know that? And they still have these winged lions, and they still have these, make these bricks out of clay, and they imprint them with the old symbols of ancient Babylon and the name of Nebuchadnezzar the king. In fact, on some of the stones that they're using to rebuild Babylon, some stones are imprinted with the name of Nebuchadnezzar, and others are printed with the name of Saddam Hussein.